Well, good morning, Nick. How are you?
Good, Matt. Happy New Year. Good to see you.
Happy New Year to you. I was looking at some of our past videos, and I realized I come across as kind of like flatline when I introduce our videos. I'm trying to be a little bit more upbeat so that people don't, click on watching this video and see me for 10 seconds, kind of eating. Hello, how are you? A little more energetic, a little more inviting.
Okay.
How's that? The new year.
I'll try to meet that too.
Yeah, we're happy. We're excited. And so, okay, so we have we really did take a break from Vogue Academy during the holidays, to the point where last night we're like, what are we talking about tomorrow? And we were rummaging around for topics, and then you happen to ask about a project I'm involved with, and that led to a discussion about the motivations for the project. So we thought, well, let's talk about that. We are going to be talking about habits, perhaps next week, but in the near future, and also shame is another topic that we want to talk about, and coming up soon. But today we thought we just explore motivations a bit more, because it is a time where people are making New Year's resolutions, they're assessing themselves and how to make this upcoming year better. And so we thought that just talking about motivations, and the why behind we're making those changes and what's motivating those changes would be helpful. Anyway, so I guess, Nick, best for me just to kind of recap how our discussion before we started recording.
Yeah, I just asked, hey, how do you approach this task and think about this project? And then you gave a really interesting example, I thought, answer.
Great. All right. So just so folks know, Vogue Academy is a startup, and that is, a project Nick and I have been working on for, well, really for years, but a little over a year we've had this company. But I'm also involved in another startup, which involves four of us, not Nick, but a couple good friends of mine. We have an app, a music discovery and music connection app that we are just about to start fundraising for. And Nick was, my role is I'll be the president of this company. And right now it's a lot of organizing, a lot of operational stuff, trying to make sure everyone is reviewing these materials, working with this marketing agency, getting this stuff done. And so what motivates me to do this work that can be tedious at times? And Nick said, that there is that dream of us making, getting the funds that we need, and then being successful with the app, just as a project itself, but also financially. And that dream of financial success and can be motivating. But I told Nick that I resist the temptation to kind of dwell or to allow myself to I don't know what's a good word.
Kind of imagine, envision,
and just kind of live in that, that state where we are successful and whatnot. Because I have had startups.
Can I jump in here for a second?
Yeah, please.
And then I pointed out that that is often advice given. Imagine that, live, experience it, feel it, and you're saying no. And I always said, oh, this is very interesting, right? This is a somewhat counterintuitive response,
right?
Strategizing.
Yeah, and I wasn't saying it's wrong to think that way. I just said, for me, I don't think that's helpful because one is I've had startups in the past that have not succeeded, and so you can get really deflated because you everything you did was based on this motivation of or this dream and hope of financial success, and it didn't come to fruition. And you're like, well, after that, it's like, well, what's the point? Like I just wasted my time. And, I think this app has a very good chance to succeed. Just, the app's called Rayrok. If you want to look us up, Rayrok, and there's a reason why it's called that. But, everything, we're already, without raising a dime, we are already in test flight. The app is actually far enough along that we can be in what's called Apple's test flight. We have users who are testing it right now. And everyone we talk to, even investors and whatnot, it is generating interest because there is this gap in the music discovery and even the music streaming world. So we're pretty excited, but it may not succeed. And, will my efforts have been in vain? And I was telling Nick, I said, for me, if I in the past I would get caught up in the dreams of success, and like I said, and yeah, just really kind of get down when it didn't work out. Versus now, I'm like, okay, I think this has a good chance of success, but what motivates me now is the problem solving and really being present, uh, and allowing that work itself to be fulfilling, and where I can invest myself. Yeah, I think just being present right now and the problem solving, that's exercising and developing my problem solving skills. It's, there's so much to learn because every other startup I've had has been more bootstrapped. Um, and this is a bigger project, so I'm learning a ton and just appreciating that um, experience and the knowledge I'm gaining, because I'm, in addition to our startup and this one I'm working on, there's actually two other ones I'm consulting for. So that's great for me just to be building up this this experience and this knowledge. Yeah, I think just for me personally, just the motivation is more present and developing myself and how I can be that much better in my work with this startup and the other startups I'm consulting on. So I'll leave it there. That's kind of what I was telling Nick, and that led to kind of our topic for today. And so I've exhausted my saucer deck. Yeah, over to you.
Well, I thought it's really cool. I mean, I think you're very sophisticated motivationally, and so a few things that stood out to me is you framed and grounded your somewhat counterintuitive strategic choices about your motivation in terms of self-knowledge. So I've had these experiences, I've gained this knowledge about myself, I know what works and what doesn't, I'm aware of some of the pitfalls or downfalls of some of these a certain kind of motivation, and therefore I'm going to make a conscious choice to turn down or kind of diminish the salience of this kind of motivation by where I put my attention, and ratchet up another kind of motivation, being present, the problem solving aspect, skill building, and those are different reasons, different motivations for engaging in the task, to be engaged in the task, and that they have these. So this brings us then to kind of what I think we bring to this discussion, to this space, is a fairly informed, rigorous thinking about, in this case, motivation. So in the common discourse out there, that you'd think, well, more motivation is better. And having this vision is, of course, good. It's exactly what you need. Many people in the discourse out there would say that's the first step, or one of the first steps, is to have this vision and imagine yourself in this place and inhabit it and feel it. And there's some power, but you're pointing out, well, there's some disadvantages to that. And I would agree with you. I'm not saying don't do that. What I'm saying is be discerning about when you use that motivation, how, be aware of its effects on you. Is it beneficial to you? Are there other motivations that are more powerful and effective? So this is grounded in this self-knowledge and self-awareness. So my point kind of that I made is, but I think, and you made it, actually use the word elusive. I think in a lot of the popular discussions, whether they be about behavior change or productivity, motivation is something that's kind of indirectly addressed, and it's very kind of elusive and amorphous, and it's just sort of assumed that, well, we don't really know what motivation is, and it's squishy, and is it really a thing, and emotions just motivation is just emotions, or something like that. And I think this is not true. This is, the mainstream psychology would say, there's a dimension of the why of action, the conative dimension, not connotative, conative, purpose, motivation, aspiration, inspiration, intention. These are words we use all the time. Our common everyday folk psychology tells us there's a complicated why of why we do things. I think a lot of people think, well, motivation happens to you. And I think you've just said, no, actually, it doesn't happen to me. I can pick and choose. I can be aware of different kinds of motivations and put my attention and effort and intention to cultivate those and lift them up, so to speak, and turn down others. So I like to use the term modulate motivation. And so I think this is not a controversial idea in, say, managing or regulating our emotions. This has got into the popular discourse. People talk about, okay, if you want to overcome procrastination, you need to manage your emotions. Unfortunately, they often say that's the only thing. And I'd say, no, that's true. We can manage our emotions. Cognitive behavioral training, CBT, and other things say, hey, we can actually influence our thoughts by how we think, the language we use, self-talk. We can gain awareness of our distortions. We can reframe things. We can affect our thoughts, and our thoughts then affect our emotions, and our emotions affect our behavior. And they're also interconnected with our motivation. But I think it's much less likely where people say, you can actually directly intervene in your motivations. And I think that's just a gap and is wrong. And the research shows that you can actually, especially adult people. And so then that brings us to this question of, again, interrupting some other ideas. So I think most people think, well, more motivation is better. And motivation is kind of one thing. It's unidimensional. And I would say that's, the research does not say that. We have, at the very least, flight and fight. One is going away, or avoidance, one is approach. But there's other kinds of, and then there's intrinsic motivation. There's motivation to maintain the self. There's motivation based on skill development. There's motivation that's altruistic. These are all different kinds of motivations. They have different features and different properties, and they affect us in different ways. And if we gain knowledge of this in a systematic way, these motivations become kind of tools in a toolkit. We can make conscious choices to put our attention on our thinking on certain kinds of motivations, and maybe put our attention away from others. So fear, I think it's not uncontroversial to say, thinking about what you're scared of in many cases is not helpful motivation. Other times it is. But we can expand then the variety of kinds and types of motivations, and then use that knowledge to help us engage, to get started, to sustain engagement, to finish. So that's kind of I want to use your example to at least at this point say, interrupt some common ways of talking about motivation, and it's not totally elusive, and research does tell us some concrete things. So what do you think? Am I accurately capturing some of the points you're making?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. What's interesting, and just to kind of tie a knot of motivations and our other work on self-awareness, is that as you were thinking, I was like, part of why I resist the temptation to be thinking about future rewards is that, if my attention is on the future, I'm less present to myself right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can be motivating. I'm not, as we said, maybe, perhaps that, thinking about the future, it can help you right now. But then is that a choice you're making, and a healthy choice? To your point, like we can modulate and work on our motivations. I know for myself that if I get caught up in the future and these ideas of, a better life, whatever, that that to me is saying that I'm dissatisfied with this present,
Mm.
and I'm unaware of it, and I don't want to be that way. And to bring in, the religious dimension, Kierkegaard talks a lot about, hope and the wishes and whatnot, and how he said, his point is that you are actively trying to disassociate yourself from who you are right now.
Mm.
You're just not aware of it. And I think he's absolutely right. I mean, it's not necessarily bad to have those, but if you're so caught up in those, and that's where you live, in that if only state, like, or if or when this happens, life is going to be so much better. Like when we get financial, the app does great. Oh, things are going to be amazing. And it either doesn't work out, or you do get it and you realize it's not necessarily that much better. I mean, how many of us are caught in this world of if only, or when this happens, and so on and so forth. And we're constantly chasing this better state versus being present to ourselves right now. And I think that's where I was
Yeah.
often in my motivations with these startups. And so for me right now, I know, I mean, you know, me, like, you know, just as people who have watched our talks, you know, I believe in this contemplative, you know, interaction, mystical union with God, and that isn't found necessarily in the future. It's can only be found in the present. So, am I present in everything I do, and am I increasingly aware of all those moments where I'm it throughout my day, so that I can be more intentional. Um, so, yeah, so I just that's a point I want, you know, that self awareness has to be it. You're only self aware if you're present of, or understanding what's going on in you right now. And it
Hmm.
might be where you are thinking about the future and these wishes and dreams and hopes, but that is something you're doing right now. And are you aware of that tendency? And are you understanding why you need to do that? Is it to motivate you? Is it there's certain dissatisfaction with your present self? So you're constantly thinking about this other new self or new reality you'll have down the road, then that's something you need to address and really think hard about.
One thought I just had is I've never thought this thought, so thank you. I wonder if that the emphasis in so much discourse out there on productivity or goal setting and goal attainment that does emphasize envisioning that may be a good strategy for productivity, maybe in like some circumstances, but is often not a very good vision for fulfillment, because you've created this ideal, this dream that won't be realized, right? You've imagined all this stuff. This takes us back to the Scotty Scheffler article, and the it seems to me, and I remember in the woman rower from the UK,
Right.
and having this vision, when my life will be perfect when I get this gold medal. And so that's obviously unrealistic, but that can be very powerful.
Yeah.
So it can be powerful to attainment, to productivity, to achievement.
Yeah.
But if that's the standard then that you have, then you're going to feel unfulfilled because that's not going to happen.
Right.
And so I never thought of that before until you were talking. Um, so given our emphasis on fulfillment, meaning, purpose, and fulfillment, this does coincide then that an emphasis on presence and present intention. So intention being in the connotative realm of psychology, the motivational, the why. Um, I think it is coherent or consistent with our general approach. So one of the things I'd want to add again, so one thing I want to say is, and put a spotlight on, is so many discussions out there, it seems to me, assume you cannot directly intervene in your motivation, that you need to create your environment, or you create a habit because you don't have motivation or you don't want to do this thing. And I think those are useful tools. We include them in the procrastination course. They're absolutely. What I don't value, and I think it can be really harmful, is to frame that in terms of, well, because there's no such thing, because you don't have motivation, or you don't have willpower, you can't harness that, it's out of your control. And I see
Mhm.
this really commonly. Why do these things need to be put in opposition to each other? They're not a binary. That people act habitually doesn't mean they don't also act intentionally and seek to manage their motivations. They're both resources. And as I said to you, I think one of the reasons you get this simplistic binary is, at least in the scholarly discourse, is to be able to make an intervention in the research, you have to kind of pick your lane, delve into, adopt a certain theoretical perspective, often a research paradigm, and that to be able to move the conceptual ball forward. And if you're doing that in the world of habit study, research of habits, then you're probably not doing that almost certainly not doing that in the world of motivation. because the amount of expertise and focus it requires. But then it seems what people then are, they convince themselves that this thing they've chosen and they believe to be most important is the only factor, for instance, in behavior change.
Right.
And I think this is, then that trickles into popular discourse and on articles on Substack or the New York Times or whatever. And then science writers often simplify and they reduce it down. So what I want to do today is kind of interrupt that and say, go back to first principles. Motivation is a dimension, is widely agreed upon. You can't argue it away. And motivation is a useful definition is energy for action. And we have different kinds of energy for different kinds of actions. So visioning and believing and having these dreams, I remember having some of those in grad school, and I would be overly excited and elated, and I couldn't focus. Why? The energy was too much, and it was too far away. I didn't want to write the actual article. I wanted to impress the people by having written it. And I'm exploring the ideas, but I'm not writing them down. That's a very different task than to think through them and build a model and conceptualize and do the hard work of crafting sentences and putting them together and getting feedback from an editor who doesn't agree. Those are very different activities. And the motivation of envisioning yourself intervening and being, using this article or piece to get a job as a professor, those are very, very far away. That's not necessarily helpful for the task at hand. And I wasn't aware of this. I wasn't thinking that at the time, but looking back, I can see I had the kind of motivation that wasn't very helpful. And so I think we can know that we can see that conceptually about motivation, but then we need to combine that with awareness of ourselves, and then also what's the task at hand, right? What are we doing right now? What kind of motivation would be most helpful for what I'm trying to do, to get activated or to stay engaged? Those could be very different motivations.
Well, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So I started rereading, I think I mentioned this author, a guy named Kurt Thompson, who's a psychiatrist, who's a Christian, and he's written a series of books. A lot of it focused on shame. And this is something I've been interested in trying to understand, because shame is a very popular topic in Christian discourse, to the point where, like, the idea of guilt, which seems fundamental to the idea of sin and guilt and whatnot, shame has almost eclipsed that. Not everywhere, but it's and Kurt Thompson is one of the main drivers of this idea of the importance of shame. And I'm not saying it's not important, but it's really interesting to me, because I think there are some distortions and some problems with it. So been rereading it. And you had made a comment to me a while ago, at least I thought you did, about psychology is really good at taking snapshots of human behavior. And
experimental psychology,
and so, like, okay, here's kind of the state, and a lot of it, as we know, psychology today is research driven in terms of, like, surveying, here, it's scientific, or there's really looking at what's quantifiable in a sense, versus Freud and Jung and others who are more, I hate to say speculative, but more interpretive, based on observation. And extrapolating from that to drive their theories of archetypes, or the libido and Oedipus cycle and whatnot. And okay, so sorry, that's all that preface is. So anyway, I was rereading Kurt Thompson. I was like, oh, it's so interesting, because they just look at these states, and the human spirit, this person is elusive when you're just looking at these states. So they look at the state of this person and look at the state of this other person who claims that they're enjoying life better. Well, that must be the right state, or the better state, or the best state, or what we all should be. And they don't really talk about what's going on beneath the surface. Does that make sense? I mean, I just really saw that really hit me for the first time reading Kurt Thompson, who is a psychiatrist and really, has immersed himself obviously in a lot of the reading. And you could see that this idea of the human spirit, what's really going on, the self-worth and the dynamic there and attention wasn't really there as, it seemed he was just driven by more of a psychological framework. I know
Yeah.
I mean, there's kind of a question in there about like, is that right to think that, or do you see that? And is that,
Yeah.
on one hand, we want to appreciate and applaud the work of psychology, but also realize its limitations.
And what limitations? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so what psychology can do and how that relates to what we're talking about. So I'd say, I mean, it's a big question. I think, let me just say that I think there's a philosophy of social science or philosophy of psychology, that these are fields that are quite illuminating and people don't study enough in graduate school. But I have a philosophical bent. And so the epistemology of essentially, how do we create knowledge? What assumptions are we making? How do we do that? What's valid claims to make? And these are often not examined by graduate students. There's almost no classes in the philosophy of psychology. I took one on the philosophy of education. I was just had a long conversation with a friend about the philosophy of reading. These are just not questions, but I think this is what a philosophical framework that you're bringing to Thomas is. But wait a second, how do you know these things? What is the basis of the claims? How do they fit together? What does it mean to collect data of a bunch of people and apply it to an individual? And what is the nature of that data? It seems like it's a snapshot and you're looking at some things and not others. I think these are core questions about what is the nature of our knowledge and what can we say. I think, and many psychologists would say that's not what we do. And I would say exactly. That's part of the problem. And that's a philosophical set of questions. And then there are certain methods and processes of conventional psychology that are accepted in most journals and how you get funding. And I'm not criticizing them, but then to make certain kinds of claims, those methods are used to make certain kinds of claims. For the most part, psychologists, contemporaries, psychological science is interested in making universals about human beings. I think that's a legitimate aim. The concern is that that's all there is to know about human beings. And I would say there's not, that and there is a subfield of individual differences that tries to get at that with a similar framework experimentally. But what I noticed in my own frustration or experience that somewhat took me to Buddhism is that the day-to-day stream of consciousness and experience, what does it feel like moment to moment, all the thoughts, and psychology is not very good at that. And it's certainly not good at explaining to me, right? I can know the general. So this is one of the things I would say. There's these kind of snapshots and we collect data and it's empirical, it's observational and empirical, but it's highly analytical. We've already decided in advance what the variables are that we're going to measure. That is not empirical. If you decide in advance what to look at, that is not empirical. That's the rational part, right? Because you decided before you even looked. And that's okay. That's necessary for science. But this idea that is purely empirical is simply not true. And so there's also the methods can look at some dimensions and not others simultaneously. But human beings are simultaneously working at multiple levels. So what exactly can these methods say about us? They can make generalizations, and that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make I think they recognize they're trying to make universal claims about processes and functions of human mind, body, brain, behavior, actions. And these are all different. These are reflected in different approaches in experimental psychology and research psychology. But there's not a really comprehensive synthesis. And what would it take to even do that? It's very, very difficult to make any kind of claims. So the point I'm trying to say, so if you want to move the ball forward to get more and more precise, also more quantitatively precise, and have these powerful statistical methods, you're often getting more and more specific. But as you do that, you're getting more attached to those things, and you're losing the interrelationships of more and more factors or features or variables. But human beings are not molecules. how I think affects what how I feel, which affects my motivation, which affects my physiology, which affects my brain function, which affects my interaction with you. So it's not only, human beings are not only complicated, we're complex. And those words are not, they're not synonyms. Complicated means there's lots of interacting parts. Complex means there's lots of interacting parts that influence one another. It's not, we're actually, human beings are not comprised of factors. A factor is a discrete, independent operating, you can do factor analysis. You can say this thing exists as a construct that influences you independent of other things. That's the definition of a factor. I don't think that even that a whole apparatus is very helpful for understanding holistically human beings. A factor is useful for pulling apart data, but not people.
Right. No, I think that's, and what's interesting is you can say that the very fact that they're not appreciating their limitations is a lack of self-awareness. Like, like when you said, like, oh, we're wholly empirical, it's like, well, no, your assumptions are not derived from some, those are determined, that help you gain a perspective by which you construct and derive your data. So
yeah, they're
that shows,
useful, hopefully simplifications, but they are simplifications, and
right.
as such, they have downsides.
Right. And so, well, but then there's with that self-awareness would come in a way, a humility to say, hey, we're talking about this very specific dimension of human existence, but just that. We're not saying it's the whole of who we are. I mean, can I just give you an example that it's related? So nowadays, obviously a lot of Christian discourse, but just everywhere, it's this idea that humans are social creatures. And that seems like, and that to me is a snapshot. Like people say, oh, we're always relating to people somehow. And that's, shame is derived from that in large part, that shame can be internalized, but it's often based on a perception of how others are perceiving you, and whatnot. And this goes back to Aristotle and others, that we are social creatures. And I would say, well, no, that's not fundamental to who we are. We are creatures who seek meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. And one way that most of us do that is through social interaction. So to me, there is like, psychologist looks at how most of us are doing things and then generalizes or universalizes versus something more fundamental, which is what we advocate for. That, no, below that is, what's core is that we are seeking meaning, purpose, fulfillment, and that relativizes anything else, like whether we're social creatures or not. We tend to be social creatures because that's a very like easy, readily available way to try to find meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. But if you don't see that something below, then you're missing something about human nature, and you just immediately assume that we're social creatures. And I'm not saying we're not social creatures. I mean, we're supposed to, it's just that there's a dynamic of human nature that you're missing by just saying we're social creatures. Does that make sense? Or does that kind of get to your point at all? Or is that taking us in another direction?
Well, I think I can make one connection would be, there's two things I want to say about that. So one way I don't want to do damage or violence to your theory or your framework, but for the purposes of psychological research, many people feel like they have to say this thing is more important than others, or psychology is often trying to get to the most general or abstract statement to say this factor, this approach is more important than others. Absolutely. They're trying to emulate the Newton and the 3 laws of physics. They're sometimes called physics envy. Like, and hopefully people get the pun in psychology of physics envy. But why should that be? Why should humans have one factor, universally, one feature that is operating most significantly? Now that could be a useful framework to kind of push your theory and see can we understand the world in that way. So, but one idea is, that is a thing that is a move conceptually and empirically that, from my understanding, research psychologists frequently do. They'll say, this is the factor that's most important. That's why I think it's most important. That's why I'm studying it. And then I'm going to make a case of why it is. But we could question whether that's actually important or necessary, even in the case for human beings ever. And then there's another kind of a weaker statement to that, which is, even if it is some factor we're most fundamentally social, is that all the time for everybody, everywhere? Like, what exactly are you saying? Is that an average? Well, and just because it's an average, does that mean how we want it to be? Maybe we should look at the people who don't do that and are happier, the outliers, the exceptions. So that's kind of what positive psychology does. So I think built into a lot of psychological research is we take an app, we do statistical analysis, and we find the mean, and then we say people do this, and then we say that somehow that's inherent in the organism. And I would just say, well, that's just typical. What do you mean? How did they get there? Why do they do that? Doesn't explain that. And so then people are making claims about human beings based upon the current averages of that sample. And I think, so I always want to add the word can. People, the statements are always like, people do this. Like, well, people can do that, or people sometimes do that. So I'll actually, if you look at my notes, I'm often frequently writing in there, well, you're taking an average and saying that's what people are. Well, first of all, even the average has a distribution. Not everybody's doing that. Some people aren't. And then we can ask, well, why aren't those people? Is it because they're genetically different? Are they more skillful? Have they learned how to manage motivation? So, well, people can't use willpower to change their behavior. Well, maybe they haven't been trained in how to use willpower. I don't know. I mean, who's trained you? So college students can't read these texts. I can't. Well, what have they been trained to do? Or is it they are unable somehow? Or they don't know what you want them to do. There's so many things, so many fat features of the situation built into these claims. So I think that the application from the general findings, what research is trying to do, to the individual is fraught.
Right.
I think this is the weakness. So what can research psychology say? I think research psychology can give us principles, broad generalizations that describe typical human beings, and that's quite useful. But it's often not telling us what human beings can, through training, experience, introspection, growth, interaction, become more skillful in. What's their potential? What's the possibility? And could that potential look qualitatively, fundamentally different than what the typical person does? So from a Buddhist point of view, it's like, yeah, if you gain enlightenment and liberation, you look like to the layperson, you look like a completely different organism. In fact, you're deified. But the Buddha said, I'm just a guy. Guess what? So did Newton. So did Einstein. So did Feynman. They just said, I'm not that different than you. I do different things than you do. And then the outcome accreted over years and years and years, I look very different than you. And so you reify that and say, I am different than you. The importance here is because that's a construct. We have this thing, ability, or what you are, separate from how you got there. I think this is fostered by this way of doing research on human beings that distills these characteristics that we quantify in some way. And then we over extrapolate what those are, right? So it's a snapshot, not a destiny. It's a snapshot. It doesn't tell us how they got there.
Well, can I ask, let me, and you probably said this, but I just want to come back to it. Why is that so tempting or so attractive to us to, we take this snapshot and then to generalize, as you said, and over extrapolate, and it's not destiny. I like that. I thought that was great. What makes it attractive to grab onto these principles or these descriptions of human behavior and say, well, that's who we are, and somehow just manipulate that or do whatever? What do you understand the question? I mean,
I totally understand the question.
Yeah.
So why do we have this tendency? It seems widespread. People do it. It's not I don't think it's uniquely American, for instance. I don't think it's
Right.
uniquely 21st century American, although it might be more, but maybe it's less. I don't know. Well, one argument would be that it's part of the human cognitive apparatus. What human minds have evolved to do is to turn these things into mental objects, to reify them, and then to be able to relate to them, and that's part of the organism, right? So I have a saying that, the human beings are designed to create beliefs, generalizations, and then to believe them.
Okay.
If I look around, that's what I see, and that's how the biological characteristics of this organism influences and is influenced by culture. We're designed to internalize these things and then create them in our heads, make them real, solidify them, and then believe those things and then act on them. And that's how human beings function. But it is not how they have to function.
Right.
That is a default mode. That is a common mode, but we can see lots of exceptions. And does that make sense? So I think that, from my psychological point of view, that is the Homo sapien organism cognitively does that. But not only that, that is the common, but we see lots of examples where we that are not appreciated, where we actually make a penetration beyond that. So let me just give you an obvious one. Does the sun rise and set? Sure looks that way. Appears to be. But we reify that. That's the intuitive experience, natural, naive observation of the world. And then we have this belief that makes sense, right? Sun's going around and going like this around the planet. Then we hold that in our heads. But we can actually come to realize, oh, that's not how it works. We can counter, right? Does that make sense? So we can reify these things, or gravity, these things are being pulled to the ground, right? Oh, that thing falls. Well, curved space, whether that's ultimately true or not. The point is, we can have these, we can see these common interpretations of appearances as creating these beliefs, reifying these seemingly obvious interpretations. But we can also get past them or through them or beyond them and make another. So to me, humans have this tendency to reify, but that can be interrupted. And it's actually interrupted all the time, but we don't notice that. And so, and psychologists should do a better job of noticing that. And therefore that, for instance, that puts in question, what does it mean if in some domains, some people sometimes are not making this penetration of a reified concept? Does that mean that's the nature of reality? People can't do it? That's inevitable? No, I don't think that's what it means at all. It means that they're not skillful in that domain. But that makes sense. That might be very abstract. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess I always go back to like more of an existential kind of
and that's why I framed it as a psychologist. So I'm waiting for your reply as an existential philosopher.
Yeah, I always think that in a way, I think first and foremost, I think a lot of us there is some level of discontent that we don't even ask, like, why do I even feel the need to improve? That's
Right.
That's an interesting question. Like we're always making these New Year's resolutions. Well, why do you need to make those to begin with? And then we're like, well, I want to lose 10 pounds, look healthier. Then like, why, like there's not, why these why questions don't really get answered. Why do you need to lose 10 pounds? I want to be healthier. Okay, well, why do you want to be healthier? Like, well, I'll feel better about myself. Like, why do you need to feel better about yourself? Like you get down, and I think there is this level of discontent, like that we aren't satisfied with ourselves right now. So I think that's an interesting point. And I think that I think there's also a deep-seated sense of being out of control. Like we tried to make improvements and they haven't worked or whatever. Like, and so if someone can come along and say, you're this, then it reduces the complexity of the problem or and makes it
Particularly if they say you're this, and part of being this is you can't be in control by yourself. So you're exculpated from. That's
right.
very appealing. But sorry, go
Well,
ahead.
yeah, I was going to say that actually we want some, like, for those who are willing to make resolutions, we want some control, but we want it to be a dial or level that's controllable. And so just change your environment, just do this. It's like, oh, great. Like, and in Atomic Habits, which we'll discuss at some point, it's, he's like, sometimes we create too many dials and too big changes, and just making these small ones can be, we can leverage to these huge changes in life, which, could be true, but it's still, there's want of control. But I think there are those who are very happy to say, oh, it's not my fault, this discontent, it's society, it's my context and whatnot. So yeah, as you said, they're exculpated from from any responsibility. But it does reduce, or it reduces the problem to something I can understand and either internalize it to the point of making a resolution, or push outside of myself so I don't have to take responsibility. Does that make sense? So that's my existential.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think from a psychological point of view, just to clarify, my position is that when we just assume motivation, to bring it back, I think, to the topic, is elusive and it's out of our control and it's only indirectly and it's this thing that you have or you don't. And then we put our attention elsewhere. It's not, the problem isn't that we put our attention elsewhere. So we only put it elsewhere. We don't put it on motivation directly. We don't say, oh, I can do something about my motivation, including changing my environment or creating social relationships or talking to myself and framing in certain ways. But I can directly address where I put my attention and focus and concentration, my energy for action, that cognitive dimension. And so this kind of binary exclusionary thinking, I think, goes back, could be part of human beings. We want to simplify. It could be grounded in how psychological research is done, where you have to be a specialist, and so you focus on one thing, and then that can easily create false binaries.
Right.
And I think so today the topic is, can we think about the cognitive dimension, our motivations? Can we put our attention on it? Can we do something about that? In your example, I think you're persuaded by it. You're saying, I know my motivational profile. I have had some experience in doing these kinds of tasks and projects. I've seen the disadvantages of certain kind of mental process of an aspiration and envisioning, which have its benefits. But for where I am right now, in the sum total, I want to put my focus elsewhere and be motivated by being present, by the process, by solving the problem at hand. And that is qualitatively different than imagining a dreamlike ideal future. And then consequently it has different effects on us and properties. And as Marty would say, it's not that it's not difficult to understand motivation, but it's not purely random. It is rule governed. We do know things about motivation and different kinds of motivation and properties. We don't know it algorithmically, but that's not because of some weakness in the squishiness of squishy-headed psychologists. It has to do with human beings being complicated and complex. You're never going to find such predictableness, but pretending therefore that you have to have that predictableness to not learn something useful about human motivation, I think that's false too. And so I like to think in terms of broad principles. The principles of motivation in general can be useful to guide you. They provide a lens to introspect on your own motivation. They can give you ideas. If that doesn't work, well, the research tells me that this is another way I might do it. But it is not, I don't think it can be ultimately descriptive or analytical explanation for any individual. That's too broad. We have too much variety.
Yeah.
We may not think that way. We don't, psychologists may not think that variety matters, but I do.
Yeah, I keep thinking that Yeah, I mean, like again, it's this elusive capacity that we have for self-awareness that you know it's just not prevalent. Like, like it's and this is something that Socrates struggled with, Kierkegaard struggled with. When
Mm.
you're self-aware, then you're doing this. And then I know for Socrates and for Kierkegaard, this is why Kierkegaard spent so much time talking about Socrates, is it if when you're self-aware and you realize that people need to become self-aware and then become their own doctors and their own, really take control over themselves on a level they haven't yet done. You can't make people self-aware. You try to create the circumstances, but so this is where Kierkegaard really looked at the nature of doubt and how to kind of awaken people to themselves and all this other kind of stuff. Anyway, but and really for what we're talking about in terms of motivations and the fact that it can be changed, it's uh, premised on the idea of self-awareness, because if you're not aware of your motivations, how can you modulate them and change them? And so that's the first thing. So like if I was continuing to be motivated by future gain, as I said before, then I'm really kind of absent to myself. And something has to happen where I say, like right now in this moment, I kind of look at myself and say, well, why am I so motivated by this future gain? Is that something that I want to be motivated by? Is that healthy? Is that what is it? And what does it say about me that I'm doing that? Is it because there is this discontent with my, or it's dissatisfaction with my current self, or not to say that it has to be the case. It's just those kind of questions are what we need to really look into. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
Well, let me kind of pick up one. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, no, but I'm just saying, like, um, and it's the point I made before, but I just keep coming back to, like, self-awareness is important to understand your motivations and really explore them and examine them. Um, but that is elusive. It's not obvious. I'll just end with this. And I've used this example before. Remember we gave that talk somewhere out in Pennsylvania, like at the high school lacrosse. And we were
Cross camp, yeah.
Yeah, we were talking about social impact, like what impact are you having? And in the middle of the talk, you were chuckling because there was one individual was participating, answering a lot of questions, and then someone next to him said, "Hey, you're drawing too much attention to us. Stop." Basically
Mm-hmm.
asked them or pleaded with them to stop participating because he didn't want the attention, which was so ironic because that's someone who doesn't realize the impact that he's having in his, what's going on. I mean, always the example comes back to me as someone who lacks self-awareness. Now, again, it's high school student. I'm just, we're not trying to pick on that person. It's just to say that's an interesting example of someone who, in that moment, is unaware of their impact by trying to get someone else to stop drawing attention to their table.
Yeah. Well, let me draw back to an example that we've used before. So I think, I'm convinced and compelled that self-awareness is a unique kind of privileged knowledge that's useful and powerful.
Yep.
And one of the main reasons I'm compelled, because I read first-person subjective accounts of people all the time saying things like, well, I thought this, and then I had this insight, and boy, my life changed, my world changed. And it doesn't always happen, but there's enough of them to say, and it's sometimes counterintuitive, but then a lot of these stories converge on some principles. So going back to the article about the paradox of Scotty Scheffler, the patterns of those individuals, these athletes that were described, are mirrored in lots of others, that they thought achievement was the source of fulfillment and it wasn't. Um, it it motivated them powerfully and they were happy to do it, but it didn't bring what they thought it would. And then with that moment of thrown back on themselves to say, why am I doing this? What's motivating me? It took a while, often this time of of unmooredness is probably condensed. We forget how long it takes, but it's and the discomfort and pain of it. But they often make an insight that then redirects them toward a similar goal, but for very different motivations. And so in some senses, actually, it's quite a different goal. And that actually is powerful and it works. And then not only does it, in many cases, guide them toward achieving that goal, but the experience of it is very, very different and often more positive. And again, these principles are about, well, the experience, the day-to-day experience, self-improvement, the relationships of teammates, the ordering of values, to see its value of to be a professional golfer who wins at tournaments for the purposes of serving a family or a community. That's a reorganization of values and aspirations. These are common patterns. Similarly, I follow the Nobel Prize website. You know, they have these little stories, and when you get awarded the Nobel Prize, apparently, you give a speech. Well, the themes in these speeches they're lockstep. They're the same over and over and over again. This is telling us, and they're counterintuitive. And the people are saying, hey, it's not about, I never thought I'd be a Nobel Prize winner. What never motivated me. I wasn't trying to, the stories are so similar. Okay. They're really hard to get through an experimental paradigm. But because it's moment to moment, day to day, over months and years about subjective experience, but the individual has a privileged access to that through awareness. Doesn't mean they will, but they have privileged access to it to make these insights. And when people recount these stories, when they're prompted to do that, they say very, very similar things, which to me says something about human beings. Generally, as a principle, doesn't mean it applies to you, but some insights. And often these insights counter to popular narratives out there, the prevailing belief systems, and sometimes they even counter experimental psychology, but often they reinforce them, but in a different way. And so that's, to me, why I'm persuaded as an empiricist that these stories are empirical. These are people who only have privileged access to the experience. Only they do. So if you're an empiricist who's interested in experience, you have to listen to these stories. And if you do experimental psychology and you don't pay attention to the experience, which most of them don't, then you're losing something. You're leaving out something fundamental about human beings, which is their experience, their interpretation of the experience, the effects of their experience, and that cannot be accessed through observational methods because they're not objective, they're subjective by definition. Human beings are subjective, and
Right.
we can observe them.
So given that, I want to get back to the so what, like, so, you know, again, I think we're not dismissive of psychological research at all. In fact, we greatly appreciate it, but we're trying to, in one hand, make sure it stays in its lane and doesn't have this outsized influence on us, where it becomes reductionistic or the silver bullet solution, which go ahead.
Well, and just to be clear, also the oversimplification in popular discourse from the psychological research.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then in that way, and again, that's not to, again, it's not to dismiss it. It's just to say, okay, here's what it's saying. But then, you know, there's all these parameters and caveats that we need to just respect, because it is giving insight, but insight based on certain factors.
Right.
So, and with that, and one of the keys for us today is to say that often motivation isn't discussed, or there's not given a robust and nuanced view of our ability to really examine our motivations and modulate them and change. Because psychology tends to say, well, we're this way, we're that way, or whatever, and because of that, taking kind of a static image of us, then of course, you know, motivations are I don't know, like, not appreciated in terms of its dynamism.
Not
Is that right?
accounted for. Yeah, it's a great word.
Yeah.
Not accounted for. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably even more so in the popularization of some of those findings, right? So, and I suspect I might do it too sometimes. So I adopt a self-worth theory, and that's one of the reasons I appreciate our conversation. So what I want to do is, or one of the things I want to do is take that framework and think through all the ways that can be useful to apply it in the dynamics and interrelationships. But I have to remember there's a bunch of assumptions that I've adopted that. And it's fun to do that. But but there's another lens, and that's an important work, which is to say, how many places, how many ways and situations and scenarios can I apply a self-worth theory to explain something that's useful to people, but not lose sight of the fact that that's a mental game. And I could adopt another perspective and do the same thing, and I could do another one and do the same thing. So the implications of saying this could be applied to procrastination doesn't exclude other explanations, doesn't exclude other factors within it. But it's easy to forget that. Or when someone who's not super knowledgeable about how research works in psychology can skip over those caveats and qualifications and not realize that what they're reading is someone's effort to try out the application of a set of principles rather than evidence. It's essentially a hypothesis rather than evidence of the accuracy or correctness of that hypothesis. You're trying to say, could I use this to explain something? Unless you specifically counter other explanations, you've not made any claims about other theories. You've just said, hey, this is relevant, this is useful, this is valid, I could use it. But it doesn't say anything about others. And I think this is a common mistake. Because some theory explains something doesn't mean another one can't too. But again, the beginner or someone who, or all due respect to journalists, they can't be experts in everything. They're not grasping the significance of these application of these ideas relative to others that are not included, right? I know, is this obscure? I'm not sure if there's an obscure point about.
I think I think it's helpful. I mean, it is abstract. I think it's I mean, this gets back to our discussion about truth theory and how oh gosh, there's a truth theory that we espouse, comprehension, like, I mean, I mean, our hope and our grail is, or our assumption is, that by understanding humans as fundamentally creatures seeking meaning, purpose, and fulfillment, or self-worth. I mean, those can be kind of dimensions of the same thing or synonymous. That to us is more my belief is that is that fundamentally explains human experience. And because people don't appreciate that, is because this sounds arrogant to say and someone elitist, but it's like, because there's not awareness that that's what's going on inside them. And so that's our goal. Now, that doesn't negate or exclude other theories. Like, it doesn't exclude the work of psychology, it actually subsumes it, and says, yes, that still operates, but you're taking these snapshots and you're forgetting this dynamism. And because there is this dynamism and you're taking snapshots, you can't capture it. And that's okay, but it's still helpful. It's how to reconcile the two that's hard to do. And I think we can
reconcile the two for oneself, for my individual peculiarities.
Yeah, but I also think theoretically. I mean, this is Dr. Loader, Jim Loader's last book called Logic of the Spirit. That's the whole book is on that principle. That's another topic for another time. Anyway, we've probably lost all viewers on this video, although it's been extremely helpful for us. But again, let's just kind of wrap up with the so what, like, why, as abstract, as seemingly irrelevant as this conversation may be to our practical lives, it is extremely practical because, how would you fill in the blank there?
Because if you read a lot of stuff out there, you would think that motivation is simply an effect and that you can't affect it, but you can. And you can with knowledge of how human motivation works. And that's what we're talking about. People are motivated by meaning, purpose, fulfillment, and their sense of self. And that's one more tool and resource that you can use to live the life that you want, that's meaningful and purposeful. And that there are some common mistakes, it seems to me, where people are avoiding or eliding, leaving out motivation as a useful lever for you to move your own actions. And in fact, you as an individual have unique access to that. You have privileged access to your own motivations if you look and know how to look.
Yeah, and I think I would fill in that blank by continuing that last thought about if you look. I mean, it's easy to be on this. I'll use treadmill because it's a good word of what people are physically trying to do is get on the treadmill, right? But I think in life we're on this treadmill where we're like on this quest for self-improvement by making these resolutions or only this time, or like we talked about, the wishes and dreams of a future better state. And I think the so what is, can you take some time to reflect on why you are making these resolutions, why you constantly live in this future state of, if only this changes, a new job, new home, new partner, spouse, or whatever, a new, a promotion, something like that. We live in these future states, and why are those so powerful to you? Like, can you examine that? Take the time to do that, because I think that's really healthy, and that's a good first step in terms of self-awareness, and not just say, yeah, and like really say, why am I like this? And then when you say, well, because I want to, this, and this. And then you ask yourself, well, what about, why do I want that? Keep asking yourself why, till you get to these really core principles in, these beliefs about what will bring me fulfillment. And then, we might be shocked by the answers that we get, where, like, I mean, I know for me, I've talked about, I was so driven by the need for recognition of any sort. That was something that was so fundamental to me, and it was so fundamental that I was unaware of it, even though it was determining most of my actions, from my work, at when I was at Prince University, or in the business world, and even physically. Like, always wanted, I wanted to be healthy because I wanted to be healthy, but a lot of it was because I wanted to look good, and I want to look good to others, and have others be like, "Whoa, he's good." And then he looks good. And then also, in sports, even, when I was diving, or even like with platform, I played this game, platform tennis, which I've mentioned, for a lot of times I'd be motivated, like, oh, I want to be like the best one out there. And people say, wow, Matt's really great. That motivated me to improve and get better. And I'm like, and it was so fundamental that I wasn't aware of it. Although, again, it was always driving me. So to become aware of that and to admit it to myself and realize that that was not who I wanted to be. I still struggle with that, but I resist that temptation. And that's partly the reason why I'm not so given to dwelling on future states of success of this current venture or all these startups, because I just don't want to be that type of person. So I work to figure out other ways to motivate me, and a lot of that involves my personal faith, because I feel like that's, where I can find the presence of God, and it's a more fulfilling life than how I was preoccupied previously. So anyway, that's my so what is to take the time to really reflect and really be honest with yourself about what's motivating you, and what in when you, again, when you really look at those motivations and why you have those motivations, that's going to reveal those core beliefs that are so core, so deep, that they're often unexamined, and you don't even realize that you have them. So anyway, that's, I don't know, does that make sense? Or
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, should we call it there?
Let's call it.
All right, Nic, I again, I always say this, but I just so appreciate our talks for myself, because I have a lot of questions and stuff that I'm wrestling with, and you provide a lot of clarity and direction. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Matt. Thanks for deepening my thinking.
Yeah. All right. Until next week.